The M4 Sherman was the workhorse of the American Army, a marvel of mass production that flooded the battlefields of Europe with overwhelming numbers. But in the summer of 1944, beneath the canopy of the Norman hedgerows, the pride of Detroit met the monsters of the Reich, and the result was a massacre. American crews, trained to believe in the superiority of their equipment, watched in horror as their shells shattered harmlessly against the thick hides of German Tigers and Panthers. They realized with a sickening jolt that they were not the hunters. They were the prey. In this war, courage was abundant, but physics was unforgiving, and the price of inadequate armor was paid in blood and fire. Now, let us return to the suffocating lanes of the Bocage, shortly after D-Day. The landscape of Normandy was a tanker's nightmare. The ancient hedgerows, mounds of earth topped with thick, tangled roots, turned every field into a fortress and every sunken road into a kill zone. For the crews of the U.S. armored divisions, the excitement of the liberation of France quickly dissolved into a grim struggle for survival. They sat inside their M4 Shermans, 30-ton machines that had performed admirably in the deserts of North Africa, but were now woefully outclassed by the heavy German cats prowling the European theater. The Sherman was tall, thinly armored, and armed with a 75mm gun that was excellent for infantry support, but largely impotent against the frontal armor of the newer German tanks. The terror often began with a sound, the distinctive dry crack of a high-velocity 80mm shell breaking the sound barrier. Before the crew even heard the report of the gun, their tank was already dead. The German WWII and the even more common Panther possessed optics and weaponry that allowed them to kill from ranges where the Americans could not even scratch the paint. A Sherman platoon commander would watch the lead tank in his column erupt into flames, the turret blown clear off the hull by the sheer kinetic energy of the impact. The crew would scramble out of the hatches, their uniforms smoking, while the remaining tanks reversed frantically, popping smoke grenades, desperate to escape the gaze of an invisible executioner. The disparity in technology created a psychological condition known among the troops as tiger fever. Every shadow in the tree line, every suspicious bush, became a tiger in the minds of the anxious crews. They knew the math was against them. To knock out a single tiger, the tactical doctrine called for a swarm of 5 Shermans. 4 would engage the German tank frontally, sacrificing themselves to distract the gunner, while the 5th attempted to race around the flank to fire at the thinner rear armor. It was a strategy of attrition that treated American tanks and their crews as disposable ammunition. Inside the cramped steel bellies of the Shermans, the men cursed the decision-makers back in Washington. They saw their rounds bounce off the glacis plates of the Panthers like pebbles thrown at a wall. They watched as the German shells sliced through their own armor as if it were butter. The Sherman earned grim nicknames like the Ronson after the cigarette lighter slogan, "Lights first time, every time," because of its tendency to ignite when hit. The ammunition storage was vulnerable, the gasoline engines were volatile, and the armor was vertical and insufficient. Desperation drove innovation in the field. Crews began welding anything they could find onto the hulls of their tanks in a frantic attempt to increase their survivability. They piled sandbags on the front slope, welded spare track links over critical areas, and even poured concrete onto the glacis. They cut logs from the forests and lashed them to the sides, hoping the wood would detonate the German-shaped charge warheads before they hit the steel. These modifications terrified the automotive engineers, who warned that the extra weight destroyed the transmissions, but the crews did not care about the transmission's lifespan. They cared about their own. The frustration was compounded by the knowledge that better technology existed. The soldiers heard rumors of a heavy tank that was supposed to be in development. They whispered about a machine with a gun big enough to crack a Tiger and armor thick enough to shrug off an 88. But week after week, as the Allies ground their way through the hedgerows and toward the breakout at St. Lo, the replacements that arrived were just more Shermans. The logistics chain was efficient at replacing losses, but it was replacing them with the same obsolete design. The commanders on the ground, men like General Omar Bradley and General George Patton, were acutely aware of the deficiency. They read the after-action reports detailing the losses. They saw the burnt-out hulks lining the roads of France, but they were hamstrung by a doctrine that had been codified years prior, a doctrine that fundamentally misunderstood the nature of armored warfare. The American military establishment had decided that tanks were not supposed to fight other tanks. That job was reserved for a different class of vehicle entirely, the tank destroyer. This doctrinal rigidity meant that while the Germans were building mobile fortresses, the Americans were deliberately keeping their main battle tanks light and undergunned. As the summer dragged on and the casualty lists grew longer, the anger in the ranks turned into a bitter cynicism. The infantry, who relied on the tanks for cover, learned to stay away from the Shermans, knowing they were magnets for high-velocity death. The tankers themselves adopted a fatalistic swagger, driving their machines with the grim knowledge that they were riding in steel coffins. They did not know that across the Atlantic, a fierce battle was being fought not with shells, but with memos and meeting minutes. The heavy tank they prayed for did exist, sitting in prototype form at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, stalled by a bureaucracy that refused to admit the war had changed. The M26 Pershing was ready to fight, but the Pentagon was not ready to let it. While the hedgerows of Normandy burned and the telegrams to next of kin flooded American mailboxes, a different kind of war was being fought 3,000 miles away in the corridors of the Pentagon. It was a war of paper, doctrine, and ego, waged not with high-explosive shells, but with memos and meeting minutes. The casualty of this bureaucratic stalemate was the T-26, the prototype that would eventually become the Pershing. The tragedy of the American heavy tank program was not that the engineers couldn't build it. It was that the Army leadership refused to buy it. The architect of this resistance was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the head of Army Ground Forces. McNair was a brilliant organizer and a fervent believer in a specific doctrine of warfare that emphasized speed and mobility above all else. In his view, the tank's primary role was to exploit breakthroughs and terrorize the enemy rear areas, much like the cavalry of the 19th century. He vehemently argued that tanks should not fight other tanks. That job, according to the official Army Field Manual, belonged to the tank destroyer, a specialized, lightly armored vehicle carrying a high-velocity gun designed to ambush enemy armor and then retreat. This doctrinal rigidity created a fatal blind spot. McNair, and his staff convinced themselves that the clashes between tanks in North Africa were anomalies, tactical errors that would not be repeated in a proper war. They insisted that the M4 Sherman, with its reliability and transportability, was the perfect tank for the American way of war. They viewed the concept of a heavy tank as a logistical burden, a lumbering beast that would collapse bridges, guzzle fuel, and clog the narrow roads of Europe. Every time the Ordnance Department, the engineers responsible for designing weapons, presented a proposal for a heavier, better-armed tank, the Army ground forces shot it down. The engineers at the Ordnance Department, led by Major General Gladian Barnes, saw the future clearly. They had studied the captured German Tigers in Tunisia. They knew that the Germans were upgunning their fleets and thickening their armor. As early as 1942, Barnes and his team were working on the T-20 series, a test bed for advanced concepts including lower profiles, automatic transmissions, and, crucially, the high-velocity 90mm gun. By 1943, this had evolved into the T-26 prototype. It was a machine that could look a tiger in the eye. It had a torsion bar suspension for a smooth ride, heavy frontal armor, and the firepower to penetrate German steel at combat ranges. But when Barnes tried to push the T-26 into mass production, he hit the McNair block. The Army ground forces argued that the 90mm gun was overkill. They claimed that the 75mm and the new 76mm guns on the Sherman were perfectly adequate. They cited shipping manifests, arguing that for every 2 heavy tanks they shipped across the Atlantic, they could ship 3 Shermans. Quantity, they insisted, was its own quality. The logic was cold and mathematical. It was better to have more inferior tanks than fewer superior ones. The debate turned bitter. General Jacob Devers, commanding the American forces in Europe before the invasion, tested the T-26 and immediately requested 250 of them. He recognized that the Sherman was becoming obsolete. McNair overruled him. The request was buried. The Army ground forces even went so far as to launch a smear campaign against the heavy tank, labeling it unreliable and untried, despite the fact that the Sherman itself had been rushed into production with barely any testing. The bureaucratic inertia was so powerful that even as the T-26 passed its trials, the order to produce it was delayed, reduced, and stalled. Then came the invasion of Normandy. The theoretical debates in Washington were shattered by the reality of the bocage. The tank-destroyer doctrine collapsed in practice. The towed anti-tank guns were too slow to deploy, and the self-propelled tank destroyers were too vulnerable to artillery and mortar fire to hold ground. The Shermans were forced to fight tanks. It was unavoidable. When a Panzer division counterattacked, the Shermans couldn't simply step aside and call for the tank destroyers. They had to stand and fight, and they were being slaughtered. The panic in the European theater of operations was immediate. General Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, finally saw the reports that his field commanders had been screaming about for months. The 76mm gun, the upgrade that was supposed to equalize the fight, was bouncing off the frontal armor of Panthers at point-blank range. The shock was absolute. The weapon that the Army had staked its reputation on was failing. Suddenly, the tone in Washington changed. The obstructionists who had blocked the heavy tank program fell silent or were reassigned. The arguments about shipping weight and bridge capacities evaporated when faced with the prospect of the Allied advance stalling due to superior German armor. In December 1944, the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, drove the point home with terrifying clarity. King Tigers crushed American lines, and the Shermans were helpless to stop them. The demand for the T-26 became a desperate shout. General Barnes and the Ordnance Department were vindicated, but vindication provided cold comfort. They had the tank, but they had lost years of production time. The factories were still tooled for Shermans. To switch them over would take months that the Allies didn't have. The T-26, now designated the M26 Pershing in honor of General John J. Pershing, was finally ordered into full production, but the timeline was agonizingly slow. The assembly lines were just starting to rev up, but the war was moving fast. In a frantic attempt to get the new weapons to the front before the war ended, the Army bypassed the usual testing and deployment protocols. There was no time for training manuals, spare parts depots, or maintenance courses. A decision was made to take the first batch of pilot models directly from the factory floor and ship them straight to the combat zone. It was a gamble. These were experimental machines, hand-built and prone to teething issues, but they were the only thing in the American inventory that could kill a King Tiger. The mission was given a code name, Zebra. It was a specialized task force designed to rush these 20 steel monsters across the ocean and into the hands of the battered crews of the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions. The bureaucracy had finally relented, but the cost of their delay was scattered across the fields of France and Belgium. Now, a race against time began. Not to design the tank, but to physically drag it into the fight before the last shot was fired. In January 1945, the docks of Antwerp, Belgium, were the most dangerous piece of real estate on Earth. The city had been liberated, but the port was the primary target for Hitler's vengeance weapons. V-1 flying bombs and V-2 ballistic rockets rained down on the harbor with terrifying irregularity, turning the cobblestone streets into craters and the warehouses into rubble. It was into this chaos that a nondescript cargo ship quietly slipped, carrying a payload that was more precious to the American armored divisions than gold or gasoline. In its hold sat 20 steel beasts, smelling of fresh factory paint and Cosmoline grease. They were the T-26E3s, the first combat-ready Pershings, and their arrival marked the beginning of Mission Zebra. This was not a standard military deployment. It was a desperate gamble authorized by the highest levels of the Pentagon. The normal protocol for introducing a new weapon system involved months of testing at Aberdeen, followed by the production of training manuals, the establishment of spare parts depots, and the slow integration of the vehicle into training units stateside. Mission Zebra threw that rulebook into the Atlantic. The situation at the front was critical. The bulge had been contained, but at a horrific cost in Sherman tanks. The commanders needed a counterpunch, and they needed it yesterday. The mission was led by Brigadier General Gladian Barnes, the Chief of Research and Development for the Ordnance Department. It was unprecedented for a general of his rank to personally accompany a shipment of equipment to the front lines, but Barnes had a point to prove. He had fought the Army ground forces for years to get this tank built, and he was determined to ensure its combat debut was flawless. Alongside him was a unique team of experts, Colonel Joseph Hawley and a cadre of civilian technicians from the Fisher Body plant in Detroit. These civilians were not soldiers. They were engineers and mechanics who knew the T-26 better than anyone else because they had built them with their own hands. They carried no rifles, only toolboxes filled with specialized wrenches and diagnostic equipment that didn't exist in any Army supply catalog. As the cranes groaned under the 46-ton weight of the Pershings, 15 tons heavier than a standard Sherman, the dock workers and supply clerks stopped to stare. The silhouette was different. It was lower, wider, and more menacing. But the feature that drew every eye was the barrel. It was a 90mm M3 gun, long and tapered, fitted with a double baffle muzzle brake. To men used to the stubby pea shooters of the Shermans, this looked like a piece of naval artillery mounted on tracks. The tanks were quickly whisked away from the target-rich environment of the port to a secret staging area. There, the Zebra mission team faced their next challenge: distribution. There were only 20 tanks. In an Army group of thousands of vehicles, 20 tanks were a statistical error. But General Omar Bradley knew their psychological value was immense. He split the shipment down the middle. 10 tanks were assigned to the 3rd Armored Division, the legendary Spearhead, and 10 were given to the 9th Armored Division. These units had borne the brunt of the fighting in the Ardennes and were severely depleted. When the trucks carrying the Pershings arrived at the division assembly areas, the reaction from the veteran crews was a mixture of awe and suspicion. They climbed over the hulls, kicking the tracks and rapping their knuckles against the glacis plate. For the first time, they felt solid resistance. The frontal armor was 4 inches of cast steel, sloped to deflect incoming fire. It was thick enough, the engineers promised, to stop the dreaded German 88mm shell. The men looked at each other, daring to hope. But hope had to be tempered with training. The crews selected to man these new machines were the best survivors the divisions had left, men who had seen multiple Shermans shot out from under them. They had exactly 5 days to learn a completely new weapon system. There were no manuals. The civilian technicians from Detroit became impromptu instructors, standing on the engine decks in the freezing mud, shouting instructions over the roar of the massive Ford GAF V8 engines. They taught the drivers how to handle the Torque-O-Matic transmission, which was smoother but more complex than the Sherman's stick shift. They showed the loaders how to handle the 90mm shells, which were nearly 3 feet long and heavy enough to break a man's foot if dropped. The gunners had the steepest learning curve. The 90mm gun was a precision instrument. It had a flatter trajectory and a higher muzzle velocity than anything they had ever fired. During the live fire practice sessions hastily arranged in a muddy field, the crews watched the tracer rounds scream downrange. The impact was visceral. When a 90mm armor-piercing shell hit a derelict hulk used for target practice, it didn't just punch a hole. It smashed through with a violence that shook the ground. The crack of the gun was sharper, louder, and more authoritative than the 75mm. For the first time in the war, the American tankers felt a strange sensation: confidence. They weren't just driving a target, they were driving a predator. The psychological shift was palpable. In the mess tents, the talk changed from survival strategies to hunting tactics. They stopped asking, "How do we run?" and started asking, "Where are they?" However, the rushed deployment meant the tanks were not perfect. The engines, adapted from a Ford design used in lighter vehicles, were slightly underpowered for the 46-ton chassis. The tanks were slow to accelerate and struggled in deep mud. The Zebra mission mechanics worked around the clock, tweaking carburetors and adjusting suspension torsion bars, trying to tune the machines for the harsh reality of the German winter. They knew that once these tanks crossed the line of departure, there would be no pit stops. By late February 1945, the crash course was over. The Zebra mission team stepped back, their job done. The crews of the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions buttoned up their hatches. The engines coughed to life, spewing blue smoke into the cold air. The 20 Pershings, the vanguard of a new era in American armor, rolled out of the assembly areas and turned their guns east. They were heading for the Roer River and beyond it, the German border. The time for testing was over. Somewhere ahead, in the ruined villages and shattered forests of the Rhineland, the Tigers were waiting, and for the first time, the Americans were bringing a cat of their own to the fight. As the new M26 Pershings rumbled toward the front lines of the Roer River sector, the men inside experienced a sensation entirely alien to the American tanker, the feeling of weight. For years, they had ridden in the M4 Sherman, a medium tank that, while reliable, felt light and precarious in a land dominated by 60-ton German behemoths. The Sherman rattled and shook. It felt like a piece of machinery that was barely containing its own vibrations. The Pershing was different. At nearly 46 tons, it did not bounce over the terrain. It crushed it. The torsion bar suspension, a system far more advanced than the Sherman's vertical volute springs, absorbed the violent ruts of the war-torn roads with a heavy, deliberate grace. To the crews, the tank felt less like a vehicle and more like a rolling bunker. But the true source of their newfound confidence lay nestled in the turret. The 90mm M3 gun was a weapon of terrifying proportions compared to the 75mm and 76mm guns they were used to. Inside the turret, the breech of the gun was massive, dominating the cramped space. The loader, usually the busiest man in the crew, found his job transformed. He was no longer tossing around shells the size of wine bottles. The 90mm rounds were over 3 feet long and weighed 42 pounds. Handling them required a different kind of rhythm, a heave rather than a toss. Yet no one complained about the weight. Every ounce of that shell represented a promise of survival. The crews knew the ballistics. They knew that the standard armor-piercing round left the muzzle at over 2,800 feet per second. But the Zebra mission had brought something even deadlier, the high-velocity armor-piercing round, or HVAP. The supply was limited. Only a handful of these silver bullets were issued to each tank, but their capabilities were staggering. With a tungsten carbide core, the HVAP round traveled at 350 feet per second. It was designed to do one thing: punch through the thick, sloped frontal armor of a German Panther or Tiger at ranges where the Sherman would have been helpless. For the first time, the American gunner didn't have to think about flanking. He didn't have to look for a weak spot. He could simply put the crosshairs on the center of the enemy silhouette and pull the trigger. The armor protection of the Pershing also fundamentally changed the psychology of the crew. On their Shermans, these men had spent months scavenging for protection. They had welded spare track links to the hull, piled sandbags on the glacis, and even poured concrete in a desperate attempt to thicken their skin. The engineers had hated it, but the crews had insisted. Now, looking at the Pershing, they saw a glacis plate that was 4 inches thick and cast at a steep 46-degree angle, offering an effective thickness of nearly 7 inches of steel. The turret face was equally formidable. For the first time, crews began stripping off the extra junk. They realized that adding sandbags to a Pershing was not only unnecessary, but detrimental to the already strained suspension. They trusted the steel. This trust was not abstract. It was visceral. When they buttoned up the heavy hatches, the sound of the world outside was muffled to a dull thud. They felt encased, protected, and removed from the vulnerability that had defined their existence in the hedgerows. As the 3rd Armored Division moved into position, the infantry began to take notice. The GI on the ground, trudging through the mud with his M1 Garand, had learned to view American tanks with a mix of gratitude and pity. They knew that if a Sherman appeared, it would attract German fire, and that fire would likely destroy the tank. But when the foot soldiers saw the Pershings rolling past, they stopped. They saw the wide tracks, the low profile, and the massive muzzle brake of the 90mm gun. They saw the way the tank sat heavy on its suspension. A ripple of excitement moved through the lines. "Look at the size of that gun," they whispered. For the infantry, the arrival of the Pershing meant that perhaps, for the first time, the zoomies in the tanks could actually kill the things that were killing them. The first test firings against German pillboxes and fortifications solidified this awe. When a Sherman fired a high-explosive shell at a concrete bunker, it chipped the paint. When the Pershing fired its 90mm HE shell, the bunker evaporated. The sheer kinetic energy of the round, combined with the massive explosive charge, turned reinforced concrete into dust. The crews watched the destruction through their periscopes with grim satisfaction. They were no longer pecking at the enemy, they were hammering him. However, this newfound power brought a dangerous temptation. In a Sherman, survival depended on speed, maneuverability, and using the terrain to hide. A Sherman commander who stood toe-to-toe with a German tank was a dead commander. Now, in the Pershing, the commanders had to unlearn the habits of fear. They had to learn to stand their ground. They had to trust that they could take a hit and keep fighting. It was a doctrinal shift that had to happen in the heat of combat. The drivers, too, had to adjust. The Ford Gaff engine, while powerful, was trying to move a mountain of steel. The tank was underpowered compared to the zippy Sherman. It couldn't sprint from cover to cover. It plodded. This lack of agility meant that once the Pershing was committed to a fight, it was there to stay. There would be no quick retreats, no darting behind a barn. The commitment was total. As late February turned to March, the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions prepared to breach the Roer River line and drive into the heart of the Rhineland. The 20 Pershings were dispersed among the columns, hidden gems amidst the sea of Shermans. The German intelligence officers, listening to the radio traffic and observing the movements, had no idea what was coming. They expected another wave of lighter tanks, easily dispatched by their entrenched 88s and their heavy panzers. They did not know that the equation had changed. The American crews, sitting in their turrets, watching the rain drip off the long barrels of their 90mm guns, were itching for the chance to introduce them to the new reality. They were no longer the underdogs. They were the tip of the spear, and they were looking for a fight. On the night of February 26, 1945, the advance of the 3rd Armored Division reached the ruined outskirts of Elsdorf. The weather was foul, a wet darkness that clung to the shattered masonry and obscured the sight lines of the nervous crews. Leading the push was Fireball, one of the eager new M26 Pershings of the 33rd Armored Regiment. The crew, commanded by Staff Sergeant Robert Machine, had positioned their tank at a makeshift roadblock, peering into the gloom. They knew the Germans were close. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash and the impending violence of a meeting engagement. But in the chaos of the urban night, the advantage of the Pershing's long-range gun was nullified. This was a knife fight in a phone booth. Unknown to Machine, lurking just 100 yards away behind the corner of a burning building, was a Tiger Eye. The German commander had spotted the silhouette of the American tank against the faint ambient light. He did not know it was a Pershing. He simply saw a target. The Tiger's turret rotated silently, the long 88mm gun leveling at the American machine. At such close range, ballistics were irrelevant. It was a point-blank execution. The silence of Elsdorf was shattered by 3 rapid, thunderous cracks. The Tiger fired 3 rounds in quick succession, a testament to the skill of the veteran German crew. The first shot was a stroke of lethal precision or terrible luck. It struck the Pershing's coaxial machine gun port, punching through the armor and detonating inside the turret. The explosion killed the gunner and the loader instantly. The second round struck the muzzle brake of the Pershing's 90mm gun, shattering the steel and causing the barrel tube to swell, rendering the main weapon useless. The third round glanced off the upper right side of the turret, gouging a deep furrow in the heavy armor and tearing away the commander's cupola hatch. Inside, Fireball. The scene was one of carnage and concussion. But crucially, what happened next defied the grim expectations of every American tanker in the European theater. The Pershing did not explode. There was no catastrophic ammunition fire. The fuel tanks did not rupture and turn the crew compartment into an incinerator. The heavy armor and the wet stowage system had done their job. The tank was knocked out, its offensive bite removed, and 2 brave men were dead, but the machine itself remained a solid steel fortress. The German Tiger, having delivered what its commander assumed was a death blow, attempted to retreat into the shadows. In the panic of the moment, the driver reversed too aggressively. The heavy tank slammed into a pile of rubble, the remains of a house destroyed by artillery. The tracks churned uselessly in the debris, and the Tiger climbed up the pile, becoming hopelessly high-centered. Realizing their vehicle was immobilized and fearing the wrath of American infantry that would surely swarm the area, the German crew bailed out and fled into the night, leaving their terrifying machine abandoned just a block away from its victim. When the sun rose over Elsdorf the next morning, the Zebra Mission Technical Team arrived to inspect the damage. They approached Fireball with a mixture of dread and clinical curiosity. They expected to find a charred husk, the standard result of a Sherman meeting a Tiger at point-blank range. Instead, they found a tank that looked battered but structurally sound. The penetration at the machine gun port was a fatal weak point. Yes, but the rest of the frontal armor had held. The glancing blow on the turret side would have sliced right through a Sherman. On the Pershing, it was just a scar. The technicians, led by Colonel Holly, immediately realized the significance of this event. The Pershing was mortal. It could be killed, but it was not fragile. It offered its crew a margin of error that the M4 had never provided. But the true test of the new system was about to begin. In a war of attrition, a damaged tank is only as good as the logistics system behind it. With a Sherman, a hit usually meant a total write-off. With Fireball, the mechanics believed they could bring it back from the dead. The repair operation was a frenzy of improvisation. The Zebra team did not have a warehouse of spare parts. They had what they had brought with them. They needed a new 90mm gun tube to replace the one shattered by the Tiger's second shot. They scavenged a barrel from another Pershing that had suffered a mechanical failure or was awaiting other repairs. They worked in the mud, using portable cranes and sheer muscle to pull the damaged gun and slide the replacement into the mantlet. They welded a patch over the hole in the coaxial port. They cleaned the interior, repairing the electrical harnesses that had been severed by shrapnel. Within a few days, Fireball was operational again. The psychological impact of this resurrection was profound. To the Germans, it must have seemed like necromancy. They had destroyed the American tank, yet here it was, back on the line, its engine roaring, its turret traversing, ready to kill. It signaled the end of the one-shot, one-kill supremacy the Wehrmacht had enjoyed for years. The Americans now had a tank that could take a punch, limp to the rear, and return to the fight. The ambush at Elsdorf served as a grim tuition fee for the Pershing crews. It taught them that their thick armor was not an invincibility star. At close range, in the chaos of urban combat, they were still vulnerable to the lethal precision of German gunnery. It reinforced the need for infantry support and flank security, but it also proved that the Pershing was a survivor. The surviving crew members of Fireball had walked away from a hit that would have cremated them in a Sherman. As the division moved forward, leaving the ruins of Elsdorf behind, the story of Fireball spread through the ranks. It wasn't a story of glorious victory, but of gritty resilience. The Pershing had been bloodied. It had lost a round, but it was still standing. And just a few days later, in the shadow of a great cathedral, the Pershing would get its chance for revenge, not in a dark ambush, but in a duel captured on film that would become the most famous tank battle of the entire war. By early March 1945, the 3rd Armored Division had pierced the heart of the Rhineland and entered the city of Cologne. Once a jewel of the German Empire, Cologne was now a moonscape of cratered streets and hollowed-out buildings, dominated by the twin Gothic spires of its famous cathedral. The fighting here was personal and claustrophobic. Every pile of rubble could hide a sniper, and every intersection was a potential kill zone. It was in this surreal, apocalyptic amphitheater that the M26 Pershing would engage in the most documented and dramatic tank duel of the entire Second World War. The stage was set by tragedy. On the afternoon of March 6th, a standard M4 Sherman turned a corner near the Komödienstrasse and ran straight into the sights of a waiting German Panther. The Panther, sitting in ambush near the train station beneath the cathedral, fired instantly. Its high-velocity 75mm shell tore through the Sherman, killing the driver and bow gunner and forcing the rest of the crew to bail out. The German tank, a 50-ton Predator with superior frontal armor, held the square. It controlled the intersection, effectively blocking the American advance toward the Rhine. In 1944, this would have been a tactical stalemate requiring artillery or a risky flanking maneuver by multiple Shermans hoping to get a lucky shot. But it was 1945, and the Americans had an answer. The call went out over the radio for the Heavy. Responding to the summons was Eagle 7, a T-26 E3 Pershing commanded by Sergeant Bob Early. Inside the turret sat Corporal Clarence Smoyer, a gunner who had cut his teeth on the Sherman and knew the terrifying math of armored warfare all too well. Smoyer was widely regarded as one of the best shots in the division, a man who could thread a needle with a high-explosive shell. As Eagle 7 rumbled over the debris-strewn streets, the crew knew exactly what they were walking into. They were being asked to hunt a panther in its own den. Watching from a mezzanine window in a nearby building was Sergeant Jim Bates of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Bates had his 16mm motion picture camera set up, hoping to capture the advance. He had just filmed the destruction of the Sherman and was now training his lens on the street where the American response would appear. He was about to film the only known footage of a heavy tank-on-tank duel in World War II. Eagle 7 moved cautiously down the parallel street. Sergeant Early guided the driver, Tech Sergeant William McVeigh, with tense, whispered commands. The plan was simple but dangerous. Drive into the intersection, expose the tank, and fire before the Panther could react. They knew the German gun was pointed at the burning Sherman, but they also knew the Panther commander was alert. As Eagle 7 nosed around the corner, the situation exploded into motion. The German commander spotted the American tank immediately. The Panther's turret, driven by a hydraulic traverse system, began to whip around. The long 75mm gun swept across the square, aiming directly for the Pershing. Inside Eagle 7, Corporal Smoyer didn't wait for the tank to stop. Shooting on the move was a risky proposition in WWII tanks. Without modern stabilization, a moving tank meant a bouncing gun, but Smoyer knew that if he waited for the suspension to settle, the Panther would fire first, and at this range, less than 200 yards, a hit from a Panther would be fatal, even to a Pershing. "Gunner! Traverse right! Steady! Fire!" Smoyer pressed the foot trigger. The 90mm gun roared, kicking up a massive cloud of dust from the street. The Pershing rocked violently on its tracks. The first round was a devastating success. It struck the Panther on the right side of the hull, just above the tracks. The 90mm armor-piercing shell didn't just penetrate. It smashed through the steel with such force that it shattered the tranquility of the square. Sparks and smoke erupted from the German tank. But Smoyer, conditioned by years of fighting enemies that refused to die, did not pause to celebrate. He knew a wounded tank could still kill. "Up! Fire!" The loader slammed another 90mm shell into the breech. Smoyer adjusted his aim and fired again. The second round hit the Panther just under the gun mantlet, the thickest part of the turret armor. It punched right through. The impact was catastrophic. The shell decapitated the internal mechanisms of the tank, likely killing the gunner and commander instantly. The Panther's gun tube, which had been traversing toward them, suddenly went limp, drooping toward the ground like a broken finger. Smoyer fired a third time. He wanted to be sure. The third shell struck the hull again, ensuring the ammunition stowage would ignite. By now, the Panther was a funeral pyre. Flames licked out of the hatches. The surviving German crew members scrambled out of the turret, rolling off the engine deck and fleeing into the ruins of the cathedral square. From his vantage point, Jim Bates captured it all. The film reel shows the raw violence of the encounter, the Pershing rolling into view, the muzzle flash of the 90mm, the three distinct impacts on the Panther, and the subsequent inferno. It was a visceral demonstration of the changing tide. For years, American crews had told stories of their shells bouncing off German armor while they watched their friends burn. Now, the roles were reversed. The Panther, the machine that had terrorized the hedgerows of Normandy, had been engaged frontally and destroyed in seconds by an American tank. The duel at the Cologne Cathedral was more than just a tactical victory. It was a symbolic turning point. The Pershing had stood nose to nose with one of the Third Reich's finest engineering achievements and had crushed it. The 90mm gun had proven its lethality. The armor had given the crew the confidence to expose themselves in a street fight. After the adrenaline faded, Eagle 7 drove past the burning carcass of its enemy. The heat radiating from the Panther was intense. The American infantry began to move up, wary but emboldened by the sight of the burning German armor. They looked at the Pershing with a new level of respect. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a guardian. For Clarence Smoyer and the crew of Eagle 7, the victory was bitter. They had won the duel, but the burning Sherman down the street was a reminder of the cost. However, they had proven that the M26 was not just a prototype or a propaganda piece. It was a war winner. As the 3rd Armored Division cleared the rest of Cologne and looked toward the Rhine River, the legend of the Pershing began to grow. The Germans were running out of room, running out of time, and finally running into an American tank that they could not bully. But the war wasn't over. The Rhine River, the mythical barrier protecting the German heartland, lay ahead. The bridges were being blown one by one. The race was on to capture a crossing before the Wehrmacht could seal the border. And leading that race, pushing their engines to the limit, were the heavy tanks of the Zebra mission. They were about to play a crucial role in one of the most fortuitous events of the war, the capture of the bridge at Remagen. On the morning of March 7, 1945, the war in Europe focused its entire weight onto a single gray ribbon of water, the Rhine. For the Allied armies, this river was the final moat protecting the heart of the Third Reich. For the retreating Wehrmacht, it was the last line of defense, a psychological barrier behind which they hoped to regroup. The standing order from Berlin was absolute. No bridge was to fall into enemy hands intact. As the American columns advanced, they were greeted by the thunderous echoes of destruction. Up and down the river, spans of steel and stone were being dropped into the freezing currents by German demolition teams. The Americans fully expected to find every crossing destroyed, forcing them into a bloody, amphibious assault against fortified banks. Leading the drive for the 9th Armored Division was Task Force Engemann, Among their mix of half-tracks and jeeps rumbled the heavy T-26E3 Pershings of the 14th Tank Battalion. These crews, fresh from the Zebra mission training, were pushing their new machines hard, struggling to keep pace with the lighter columns on the winding, debris-cluttered roads leading down to the river valley. The mood was tense. The commanders were racing not just against the enemy, but against the clock, hoping to catch a glimpse of the river before the fog of war turned into the smoke of demolition charges. At 1 p.m., the lead elements of the task force crested a ridge overlooking the town of Remagen. The sight that met their eyes was so unexpected that many soldiers thought it was a mirage. Below them, spanning the wide, dark waters of the Rhine, stood the Ludendorff Bridge. It was a massive railway structure, its dark stone towers standing like sentinels, its steel arch intact. Traffic was still moving across it, a chaotic stream of retreating German vehicles and infantry. It was still standing. The radio net exploded with frantic chatter. The order came down immediately. Take it. Take it now. But taking a bridge rigged for demolition was a suicide mission. The Germans had packed the structure with explosives. They were waiting for the Americans to get close enough to crowd the span, or simply waiting for the last of their own troops to cross. To storm the bridge, the Americans needed to suppress the German defenders who were dug into the stone towers on the far bank and positioned on a flak barge anchored in the river. This was a job that the light machine guns of the infantry could not handle. It was a job for the heavy armor. The Pershings moved into position on the high ground and the riverbank, their long 90mm guns swiveling toward the German defenses. This was the moment the M26 had been built for. In a Sherman, engaging a fortified stone tower at that range with a 75mm gun would have been a slow process of chipping away at the masonry. With the Pershing, it was an exercise in demolition. The gunners looked through their telescopic sights, the optics clear and magnified. They laid their crosshairs on the firing slits of the stone towers on the east bank. When the Pershings opened fire, the sound was distinct, a sharp, cracking roar that echoed off the valley walls. The impact of the 90mm shells was devastating. They didn't just suppress the German machine gunners, they obliterated the positions. Chunks of stone the size of cars were blasted off the towers. The high-velocity rounds punched through the heavy masonry walls, silencing the Spandau machine guns that were raking the American infantry. The Pershings effectively turned the stone fortresses into death traps for the defenders. Simultaneously, the tanks engaged the flak barge in the river. A few well-placed high-explosive rounds turned the floating battery into a burning wreck, removing the threat of anti-aircraft guns being turned on the ground troops. The precision of the 90mm gun allowed the American tanks to provide sniper-like support for the infantrymen of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, who were now sprinting toward the bridge approach. As the Americans rushed the bridge, the German engineers on the far side panicked. They turned the key to blow the charges. A massive explosion rocked the valley. A plume of smoke and water erupted alongside the bridge, and the ground shook violently. The American tankers watched through their periscopes, their hearts sinking, expecting to see the steel span crumble into the river. But as the smoke cleared, a shout went up from thousands of throats. The bridge had lifted into the air, settled back down, and held. The demolition charge had damaged the decking, but the main arch was intact. The miracle of Remagen had happened. The Pershing crews didn't pause to marvel. They poured fire onto the far bank, creating a curtain of steel that kept the German heads down while the American engineers and infantry raced across the damaged span, cutting wires and throwing demolition charges into the river. The heavy tanks couldn't cross immediately. Engineers had to check the structural integrity of the damaged bridge to see if it could hold 46 tons of American steel. But their presence on the West Bank was the decisive factor in the crossing. They acted as an unassailable overwatch, a battery of mobile artillery that destroyed any German attempt to counterattack the fragile toehold. Throughout the afternoon and into the night, the Pershings stood guard. The Germans, realizing the catastrophe that had just occurred, threw everything they had at the bridge. They sent Luftwaffe dive bombers, fired V-2 rockets, and even deployed frogmen to blow it up. But the heavy tanks on the West Bank, along with the hastily assembled anti-aircraft batteries, maintained a dome of protection. When the engineers finally reinforced the decking and gave the all-clear for heavy armor, the Pershings were among the first tanks to rumble across the Ludendorff Bridge. The sound of their tracks, clanking on the wooden planks, was the death knell of the Third Reich's defense strategy. As they reached the East Bank, the crews looked back at the Rhine. They had crossed the uncrossable barrier. The capture of Remagen was a psychological breaker. It shattered the German hope of a prolonged defense on the river, and for the men of the Zebra mission, it was the ultimate validation. They had rushed these experimental tanks across the ocean, struggled through the mud of the depots, and fought through the ruins of the Rhineland for this exact moment. They were now deep in enemy territory, driving the heaviest, most powerful tanks the U.S. Army had ever fielded. The road to Berlin was open. But the Germans had one final card to play. As the Allied bridgehead expanded, the Wehrmacht mobilized its heaviest reserves. The King Tiger, the Königstiger, was moving to intercept the American breakout. This was the monster the Pershing had been born to fight. 68 tons of German steel, armed with the terrifying long 88mm gun. The final chapter of the Pershing's war would not be against bunkers or bridges, but against the apex predator of the German Panzer divisions. The capture of the Remagen Bridge ruptured the German defensive line, spewing Allied forces into the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. The Wehrmacht, reeling from the breach, scrambled to assemble its remaining heavy armor for a final desperate stand. Among the units thrown into the path of the advancing Americans was the 512th Heavy Panzerjäger Battalion, equipped with the Jagdtiger, a 70-ton behemoth built on a King Tiger chassis, carrying a massive 128mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank from 2 miles away. Alongside them were the remnants of the King Tiger battalions. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation between the best of American industry and the terrifying peak of German engineering. For the Pershing crews, the King Tiger was the final boss. Throughout the war, the Tiger II had been a mythical beast, a machine whispered about in hushed tones. Its frontal armor was virtually impenetrable to standard Allied guns. Its 88mm KWK-43 gun could kill a Sherman before the American crew even saw the muzzle flash. But the Pershing crews were no longer driving Shermans. They were driving the T-26E3, and they were carrying the HVAP ammunition that leveled the playing field. The encounters in the final weeks of the war were sporadic but violent clashes that proved the dominance of the new American design. One such engagement occurred near the town of Dessau. A column of American armor, spearheaded by a Pershing commanded by Staff Sergeant Nick Mashlonik, ran into a German ambush. A King Tiger and a Panther were dug in waiting. In 1944, this would have been a massacre. The lead American tanks would have burned, and the column would have retreated to call for air support. But Mashlonik didn't retreat. He spotted the Panther first. It was moving to flank the column, its long gun traversing. Mashlonik's gunner fired a single 90mm round. The shell struck the Panther's flank, detonating the ammunition and blowing the turret cleanly off the hull. The violence of the explosion signaled to the German defenders that this was not a standard Sherman platoon. Then, the King Tiger revealed itself. It was a massive, hulking shape in the tree line, its thick-sloped armor designed to shrug off enemy fire. Mashlonik ordered his driver to hull down, using the terrain to protect the Pershing's lower plate. He loaded an HVAP round, the silver bullet, with the tungsten core. When the King Tiger fired, its shell went high, missing the low-profile Pershing. Mashlonik did not miss. His 90mm round screamed across the gap and slammed into the front of the King Tiger. The result was shocking to both sides. The HVAP round didn't bounce. It punched through the thick glacis plate of the King Tiger, the invincible armor that German propaganda had touted as impenetrable. The German tank shuddered and went still, smoke pouring from its hatches. The crew bailed out, stunned that their fortress had been breached. It was a vindication of General Barnes and the Ordnance Department. The Pershing had cracked the toughest nut in the German arsenal. However, the M26 was not without its flaws. The rush to deploy meant that the automotive systems were still strained. The engines overheated, and fan belts snapped with frustrating regularity. The tanks were thirsty, guzzling fuel at a rate that terrified the supply officers. But these were mechanical teething troubles, not fatal design flaws. In combat, the tank did exactly what it was designed to do. It survived, and it killed. Another incident underscored the Pershing's durability. A T-26E3 was hit by two high-explosive rounds from a German 150mm field gun, artillery capable of tearing a Sherman apart. The Pershing was rocked by the concussions, the external stowage bins were ripped away, and the optics were smashed. But the armor held. The crew, shaken and deafened, backed the tank out of the line of fire. After minor repairs at a field depot, the tank was back in action 2 days later. The crew patted the steel hull affectionately. They knew they were alive only because of those 4 inches of Detroit steel. As the war in Europe ground to its inevitable halt in May 1945, the Pershing had firmly established its reputation. It had arrived too late to change the course of the war. The Allied victory was already sealed by the time the Zebra mission landed, but it arrived just in time to save the lives of the men who crewed it. It proved that American industry could produce a tank that didn't just rely on numbers, but on quality. It ended the Tiger fever that had plagued the armored division since North Africa. The American tanker could finally look a German tanker in the eye and know that he had the tools to win. The final tally for the Zebra mission was impressive. The 20 tanks had seen intense combat in the most dangerous sectors of the front. They had destroyed Tigers, Panthers, and Panzerfus. They had blasted pillboxes and captured bridges. Losses were minimal, and in almost every case where a Pershing was hit, the crew survived. The death traps of the Normandy hedgerows were a thing of the past. When the victory in Europe was declared on May 8, 1945, the Pershings were sitting in the heart of Germany and Czechoslovakia. They were parked in the town squares of conquered cities, their long guns silent, draped with Allied flags. The crews sat on the turrets, smoking cigarettes, watching the endless columns of German prisoners marching west. Among the prisoners were the crews of the Panthers, men who had started the war believing in the superiority of their machines. Now they walked past the M26s, looking at the thick armor and the 90-millimeter guns, realizing that the sleeping giant across the Atlantic had not just woken up, it had armored itself. The war was over, but the legacy of the Pershing was just beginning. It would shed its designation as a heavy tank and become the first main battle tank of the U.S. Army, the grandfather of the Patton series, and the lineage that would lead to the M1 Abrams. It was the bridge between the mass-produced desperation of World War II and the technological dominance of the Cold War. But for the men of the Zebra mission, it was simply the machine that had brought them home. The arrival of the M26 Pershing in the final months of World War II was more than just a technological upgrade. It was a moral redemption for the American armored force. For years, brave crews had fought with the nagging knowledge that their government had sent them into battle with inferior equipment, asking them to compensate for thin armor with blood and courage. The Pershing finally balanced the scales. It proved that the arsenal of democracy could build a hammer as well as a swarm. While it came too late to save the thousands of Sherman crews lost in the hedgerows of France or the snows of the Bulge, the Pershing stands as a monument to the persistence of those engineers and soldiers who refused to accept the status quo. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and laid the foundation for a new era of American armored dominance. The duel at Cologne and the capture of Remagen are not just stories of steel smashing steel. They are the closing arguments in a long, bloody debate, proving once and for all that American ingenuity, when finally unleashed, was second to none.